If you undertake a role which is beyond your powers, you both disgrace yourself in that one and at the same time neglect the role which you might have filled with success. Epictetus believes that every one of us has some determinate roles that we're supposed to fill. And he doesn't say how this is revealed to us. We might think in our own time about, when we take aptitude tests and find out, what seems to suit us well, trying out different professions, all sorts of things along those lines that are kind of experimental or analytic. That could be quite helpful. They didn't have all those tools or opportunities in Epictetus' time, but he thought that people had some sort of role that was actually their own. He talks earlier in the Enchiridion about being part of a play in which we each get our role, and we don't get to choose the role, but we choose how we play it. Here he talks about the possibility of taking on a role that isn't well suited to us, but which we might be more attracted to. So what he means by role here is actually prosopon, quite literally the mask that the actors would put on. That is the word that we get person from, and it goes into Latin as persona. And so, who are you going to be? Who are you presenting yourself as? Who are you understanding yourself to be? What role are you taking on? That's the question here. And we can reject the role that we're given or which has been assigned to us, however you want to think about it. And if we do that, we're either not going to have any role at all, which is rather tough to do, or we're going to have to take on something else. And we may try to take on roles that we're not suited for because we would like to think of ourselves as that kind of person. We're attracted to that notion. People do this quite often in terms of, wanting to be, say, I'd like to be a therapist, or I would like to be a great writer, or I want to be the successful business person. And they just keep working at it and doing a pretty poor job at it, sometimes actually hurting other people in the process as well as themselves. And it just doesn't come out. Some people want to be, the ultimate attractive person, and that's where they invest their time and attention. So we really need to think about where we fit in, what does suit us, because like he points out, if you undertake a role which is beyond your powers, you will disgrace yourself in that role. You're not going to do a good job. So, there's certain things that I know I'm not good at. Some of them I had to learn the hard way by trying them out and finding, no, I'm not good at that. If I decide that I want to be a great musician and lead a band as the bassist and singer, I can do that if my aim is to have a garage band in my spare time with a bunch of other people. But if my goal is to be a professional musician and model myself after, I don't know, Algie Ward or Blackie Lawless or any of these people that I like listening to, I would be terrible at that. And I would be essentially throwing my time and effort away. And I would suppose my fellow bandmates, if they're any good, at a certain point would say, we need to get rid of this guy. And it's that way with many other things as well. That's not to say that we can't test out what we might be good at. We live in a world with many more opportunities than the time that Epictetus wrote. We have much more social mobility, at least in certain senses. So it's not to say that we can't go to school for things. But if you don't think that you really want to be a doctor, don't go pre-med and then medical school. If you don't think that you want to practice law, for God's sake, don't go to law school. Find something else that would be better suited to what you want to do. Because the other part of this is, he says, if you undertake a role that's beyond your abilities, not only are you going to disgrace yourself, you're also going to neglect the role which you might have filled with success. Epictetus thinks that all of us have some role, some place, some position that we can actually fulfill. Literally in Greek, to fill up, plerostai. And it may not be the one that we would like for ourselves. It may not be one that's, very remunerative or opens up a lot of doors, or society says is really great and does shows about. But we are still doing something good if we fulfill that role. We live, for example, I'll use a culinary example. We live in a society and culture now that elevates the celebrity chef. Well, not everybody can be a chef. As a matter of fact, first you got to be a cook, and you got to work your way up through the different stations. And perhaps you're never going to do that. Perhaps you stay a line cook your entire life. If you're a line cook and you actually do a good job as a line cook, you probably make hundreds of people happy a day. You fill them with nourishing, well-cooked, nicely plated food. You brighten that portion of their day. You're an important person, even if you're not the executive chef. Likewise, I have a great appreciation for secretaries because my mother was a secretary for many years. I know that quite often that's the part of the office where the real work gets done. And so I always make sure whenever I'm dealing with any sort of firm or office to get to know the secretaries, because I want to know how things are actually going to happen in the place, because the work that they do is quite often more important than the bits of things that the higher ups are doing, the managers, the executives, even though they don't really know that upstairs. And we could go on and on and on and on. In a band, I think the most important person is the bass player. But that's just my view on it, but I could give you some good reasons for that. The point is, if you want to fulfill your role well, that is something within your power. Fulfilling another role well that you're not suited for, that's not something in your power.
Just as you are careful in walking about not to step on a nail or to sprain your ankle, so be careful also not to hurt your governing principle. And if we observe this rule in every action, we shall be more secure in settling about it.
This is a nice analogy that Epictetus is making here in chapter 38. Just as you're careful in walking about not to step on a nail, literally to place yourself on top of the iron, or to sprain your ankle or your foot, so you need to equally take care not to damage, not to harm your governing principle, the hegemonikon within yourself. And, well, what is this governing principle or ruling principle? That is something that, for the Stoics and for Epictetus in particular, encompasses the higher functions of the human being. The capacity for reasoning, what we call the rational faculty on the one hand, he logistike dunamis, and the faculty of choice or moral purpose, the proairesis. Those are actually all the same thing, just looked at from different sides, and Epictetus calls that the governing principle because it does rule us if we use it correctly. Even if we use it incorrectly, we end up ruling ourselves, but we rule ourselves poorly, which typically means letting other things decide, other things coming from the outside, other people's views, their desires for us, or our own unruly desires and aversions which are not properly understood and dealt with. So we need to take a lot of care not to damage our governing principle. And this is something that at first is a little bit difficult to remind yourself of. So here's an example. Somebody does something and you find yourself getting angry, and now you're at the point where you're like, I'm going to tell that person to go, do something to themselves. Now, you can say to yourself at that point, if you take a little pause, governing principle, you do have a choice here. Are you going to make the choice that's going to feel good at the moment, but is actually probably going to irritate that person, damage the relationship, and most of all, damage your own governing principle? Because giving in to anger from a Stoic perspective is not going to make anything better. Certainly not going to make you better. It's actually going to make you worse. Or are you going to favor your governing principle and realize that you can't follow through on that anger impulse, and that you probably should chalk this one up as a loss, the fact that you already got angry. That's tough to do. That's very difficult in a real concrete situation to bring to mind that. So Epictetus says, if we observe this rule in every action, we will be more secure in setting about it. That means that at first we have to remind ourselves, and it's going to feel very artificial, what's at stake here? My governing principle. Maybe we say to it, we say that to ourselves in a different way. My faculty of choice, that's also very abstract. Maybe we say something like, being a Stoic, improving my life, someday being free and being happy. Maybe those things are what we need to do. Or perhaps it's better to place it in terms of a kind of moral language, like doing what I know is the right thing for myself, not just at this moment, but for my broader life plan. We have to continually remind ourselves, and what language we use can vary. Can be very pragmatic about this. We use what works, but we have to remind ourselves of this as we get into difficult situations over and over again. And if we do that, it will gradually become easier to recognize when we're at danger of damaging our governing principle by the other thing that we're ready to choose or to do. But at first it's going to be quite difficult, and only later does it become easy. It's something that we have to master through repetition.
Each man's body is a measure for his property, just as the foot is a measure for his shoe. If then you abide by this principle, you will maintain the proper measure. But if you go beyond it, you cannot help but fall headlong over a precipice, as it were, in the end. So also in the case of your shoe. If once you go beyond the foot, you get first a gilded shoe, then a purple one, then an embroidered one. For once you go beyond the measure, there is no limit.
Chapter 39 is a rather curious one, in part because Epictetus, after telling us so many times in the Enchiridion and also in his discourses that the body is really something external, doesn't matter quite so much, although the use of the body does matter quite a bit, and we should also take care of it. Here he's talking explicitly about the body and how we treat it, and he's giving us some advice for that. What he's saying is totally consistent with Stoic doctrine. As a matter of fact, it's not just the Stoics who say this sort of thing, but some of the other ancient schools of philosophy as well. It's really great advice. Each person's body is a measure for their property. So what he's talking about there is the relation between two different externals. Our bodies, which we can't get away from, right? When our bodies die, from the Stoic perspective, that's it, we're dead. Our external goods in property, the things that we own, the things that we use, the things that we deploy, you could say. Here it's ktesios, meaning, it's coming from the word for possessions, but it could also mean, all the other things that we have as well. And Epictetus doesn't say that we don't need any property. The fact that it's external doesn't mean that it doesn't matter at all. I mean, our use of it does, and we need some of it as necessities for life, right? So there is some purpose to it. How much should these external things matter to us? How much should we be partaking in them? How much should we worry about them? That's where the key question arises. So he says, the body is a measure for property, just as the foot is a measure for the shoe. This is a great example, right? I love this one. If you abide by this principle, he says, you'll maintain the proper measure. But if you go beyond it, you cannot help but fall headlong over a precipice as well in the end. If we stick to what our body needs and don't go into the realm of all sorts of crazy desires, which can't be satisfied and are continually provoking other desires, and for which in our own time there's an entire industry out there ready to cater to you, available on the internet as well as face to face for satisfying and then reawakening your desires about these sorts of things. If we do that, we're never going to reach an end to it. So how does this foot and shoe example play out? He says, okay, in the case of your shoe, if once you go beyond the foot, what the foot needs, then you get a gilded shoe. What is a gilded shoe? It's got some gold on it, right? Now think about footwear and what people in our own time put into it. Think about women's fashion, for one thing. All the shoes out there, all these, crazy designs, which are often uncomfortable, but are, in some way designed to make things look good. And there's a bit of competition involved as well. And then there's like the whole aspect of putting a designer label on it and getting to charge 10 times as much for it. The economy of scarcity or luxury or whatever you want to call it. Men are not immune to that either, right? I'll give you a few examples that I think I can relate to, some of which I can't so much. Designer footwear, never been into that myself. I see people spending hundreds of dollars on athletic shoes, and I think to myself, wow, that person must really be into athletics, because otherwise that's a total waste of their money. But why are they buying them? Because it makes them feel good in some way. They like people looking at them. Their strange colors or slightly off design. It's this year's version. Okay, there's all that, and we can laugh about that quite a bit. I'm much more of a kind of down-homey sort, and I like work boots. When I was in the Army and shortly afterwards, I loved wearing combat boots because they were so versatile for many things. But you can pay a lot for those sorts of things. And men have their own designer brands that they buy into, and they need the label on it to show everybody that they've got this sort of thing. I, in general, and this may seem a little bit dated, I'm willing to pay anywhere from $40 up to $80 for a good pair of work boots. And, they may not last forever, but I'm very hard on things. I cannot see paying much more than that. That's that's the sort of equivalent of the gilded shoe. And unless I'm actually planning on doing outdoors work, I don't deserve work boots. I certainly don't need steel-toed boots for most of the things that I do. When I used to handle a chainsaw, I used to have steel-toed boots, and that was kind of a good idea. But for the sort of things that I do day to day, living in an apartment, not really necessary, right? And here, following up on Epictetus' example, first we get a gilded shoe, right? So there's gold on it. Then a purple one. Now, purple was a luxury product in ancient Greece and Rome. It had to be gathered from these shellfish, and so there were actually laws about who could wear purple and who couldn't. So this is like putting things really high end, sort of like you're not just bedazzling it with rhinestones. You're going to put some diamonds on your shoes or something like that. And then he says, then an embroidered one. Now we might think of embroidery as something kind of low class these days, because we have all sorts of machines that do it. But think about what it took in ancient times. Now, do you need all of that for your little feet to get around? Absolutely not. You don't need anything remotely like that. We can say the same thing with other clothing. There probably is a difference between a $5,000 suit and a $300 suit in how it wears and how it looks and stuff like that. Probably not worth the $5,000. And if other people are looking at you and saying, oh, you don't have a $5,000 suit, you're not really important, I don't need to listen to you. From a Stoic perspective, you can exclude those people. And we can go on and on and on. We could ask not only about clothing, we could ask about the houses that we live in. How badly do we need air conditioning? Do we need air conditioning everywhere? How much do we need to have all these luxury products to cater to our body for our comfort? That's a good live question to ask ourselves, not only in terms of our society and the places that we go in every day, but also in terms of our own living quarters. Do we need a television in every waiting room so that people can keep their eyes up there and watch the daytime television? Or would it be better actually to get rid of the TV and maybe have a few books? That's not just tailoring to the body, but also to the mind. But you get the idea that Epictetus is talking about here. Our needs are actually fairly small. They're fairly limited. It's very easy to go beyond them. And once we do, it's a never-ending process that we can get sucked into and start to believe that these desires or wants are actually needs. And then we're setting ourselves to be supremely unhappy in how we live our life, in our relationships, in the competitiveness that it requires. And the only way to get out of that is to go back to what it is that our body really needs, to use the body as the measure for the possessions.
Immediately after they are 14, women are called ladies by men, and so when they see that they have nothing else but only to be the bedfellows of men, they begin to beautify themselves and put all their hopes in that. It is worthwhile for us to take pains, therefore, to make them understand that they are honored for nothing else but only for appearing modest and self-respecting.
Chapter 40 is unfortunately just as relevant in our own time as it was in Epictetus's time. We have entire industries that center around telling women what they ought to wear, how they ought to look, placing them in competition with each other over so many different things, inculcating all these codes. We also have, feminist philosophy and theory that sometimes manages to critique that well, although sometimes it gets sucked into that in interesting ways. And it's not as if men don't have any sort of complicity in this. What he's talking about here is the reduction of women to sexual objects. So he says, once they're 14, and it happens much earlier now, women are called ladies by men, and so they see. This is the message that they take from that. They have nothing else but to be the bedfellows of men. So then they begin to beautify themselves, to put all their hopes in that. This is a common problem. Epictetus is criticizing this. He is saying, this is a great loss. This is not how we should be treating people. This is not the message that we want to send. And this continues on through the centuries, like I said, down to our own time. And it's not just men who are doing it. Women also send this message. And we can say this about many other things, and we'll get to some examples about how other people, and other groups can be similarly getting messages like this as well. But let's follow this out. So he says, it's worthwhile for us to take pains to make them understand that they're honored for something else, for nothing else, according to Epictetus, but only for appearing modest and self-respecting. The Greek for that is kosmiai, kai idomones. So idomones means something like, having a sense of shame or having a sense of self-respect. So that's a good thing. And then the cosmos word that he's using there means something like a real attractiveness that has to do with order in one's life. So he's saying, the beautification industry that's out there is giving a false sense of beauty, one that appeals just to the sensual desires. And what we want people to be geared towards is something better than that, both those who are desiring and those who want to be the objects of desire. Now, like I said, we can expand this considerably. This doesn't just pertain to women being objectified as sexual objects. We can talk about how society sends messages to young men that, on the one hand, you only matter if you're earning. Coffees for closers, as the great line goes, right? Or that they only matter if they're being super macho and tough and all that. And we can go on and on and on with different messages that we're sending people. What is the core of this? We're telling people that they only matter if they measure up to certain desires that we have or desires that other people have. There's no unconditional value to these people. They only matter insofar as they fit somebody else's fantasia, a fantasy, an imagination. The same word that Epictetus uses for appearance. There's very fruitful considerations come out of this. What he's talking about has to do explicitly with feminine sexuality and with what we nowadays call the male gaze. But I think that it can be expanded greatly into many other fields as sort of a general principle in ways that we objectify other people. Now, what can we take from this? We can look to see whether we ourselves have fallen into that process of objectivization, whether by being objectified and buying into it and then being unhappy because you can never actually satisfy what you're being told to do, or whether we ourselves have been the objectifiers, or at least the replicators of somebody else engaging in the objectifying. All of this is essentially incompatible with the way of living and thinking and relating to other people that Stoicism advocates. So if we understand this, we end up having a choice. And now notice what Epictetus says. He doesn't say, well, we just withdraw from it altogether. Instead, we try to take those who are being objectified and we say, no, you actually do have value. Not for what they're telling you you have value. You have value for something else. We could quibble with how Epictetus approaches women. I think that we could probably say he could have done a better job in saying what they would be valued for. But you get the message that instead of saying, yes, what society tells you or what these people over here are telling you, you can matter for, but you can never actually satisfy. You matter because you're a human being. You matter because you have a faculty of choice. You matter because you have the potential for freedom and happiness.